On February 1st, 1927, 1,200 people in black tie gathered on 10 acres of Waikiki beachfront for the opening of the Royal Hawaiian Hotel. The building was 6 stories of pink stucco in a Spanish Moorish style that the architects Warren and Wetmore of New York had borrowed from the silent films of Rudolph Valentino. It had 400 rooms, each with a private bath and balcony. It had cost $4 million. Over $65 million in today's money. And the man behind it, Ed Tenney of Castle and Cook, had ensured it was the largest building project in the entire Pacific. Guests arrived on Matson Navigation Company steamships after 4.5 days at sea from San Francisco. And when they stepped off the gangway at the Aloha Tower Pier, someone draped a plumeria lei around their neck, and a Hawaiian string ensemble played ukulele. The Pink Palace of the Pacific, they called it. It was built on land where Hawaiian royalty had once kept a summer palace, on a beach named Waikiki, spouting waters that for centuries had been a network of fish ponds, taro fields, and sacred temples fed by mountain streams. By the time the hotel opened, those streams had been diverted, those wetlands were being drained, and the land underneath the dance floor had been manufactured from coral and sediment dredged out of a brand new canal. The party was magnificent. The product was already a copy. That canal was the Ala Wai, and its construction between 1921 and 1928 is the decision that made modern Hawaii possible. Before the canal, Waikiki was roughly 2,000 acres of marshland, rice paddies farmed by Chinese immigrants, duck ponds, fish ponds, mosquito-thick wetlands that flooded seasonally when the streams from Waikiki and Manoa valleys emptied into the lowlands. It was, by most accounts, gorgeous and complicated and alive. Lucius Pinkham, the president of the Territorial Board of Health, called it unsanitary. He proposed draining the whole thing, and when nobody listened, he got himself appointed governor and approved the project himself. The man who actually built it was Walter Dillingham, whose Hawaiian dredging company excavated the 1.5-mile channel and then sold the dredged material, the coral, the mud, the remnants of centuries of cultivation, to developers who used it to raise the elevation of the newly created land. 625 acres of wetland disappeared. The streams that had fed Waikiki for generations were rerouted into the canal. The property values went from around $500 an acre to nearly $7,000. Dillingham built himself a coral-pink Italian villa on the slopes of Diamond Head to watch the construction below. Time magazine later named him the #1 tycoon of the islands. The original plan called for a second outlet at the far end of the canal, so ocean water would flow through and keep things clean. But funding ran short during the Depression, and engineers realized the current would carry the outflow right along Waikiki Beach, so they never built it. Without that outlet, the eastern half of the Ala Wai became a stagnant pond that to this day traps runoff, pesticides, heavy metals, and periodically raw sewage. The canal that created Hawaii's tourist industry also created a permanent contamination problem that sits about 3 blocks from the most expensive hotel rooms in the Pacific. But in 1927, none of that mattered. The Royal Hawaiian had opened, and the Matson Navigation Company had a business model that was, in hindsight, a blueprint for everything that would follow. Matson didn't just operate steamships. They built the ships, built the hotels, and ran both as a single, vertically integrated luxury experience. Their flagship, the SS Malolo, the name means flying fish, was the fastest vessel in the Pacific, cruising at 22 knots, and it carried passengers whose suites included servants' quarters. 3 more luxury liners followed by 1932, the Mariposa, the Monterey, and the Lure Line, named after the founder's daughter. Matson's white ships were the only way to reach Hawaii for decades, and the company ensured that every mile of ocean and every night ashore was spent inside their ecosystem. In 1929, the San Francisco Chamber of Commerce and Matson organized a cruise aboard the Malolo with 325 passengers, every one a certified millionaire, hand-picked by the Chamber. They called it the Millionaire's Cruise. It departed on September 21st, 1929. 38 days later, the stock market crashed. The timing was poetic, but Matson survived. By 1955, more than half of all tourists to Hawaii stayed in a Matson hotel, though only a fifth still came by ship. Planes were getting faster and cheaper, and the steamship era was ending even as Matson's hotel empire expanded. The company that had once controlled every minute of the tourist experience was about to lose control of the one thing that had made control possible: the journey itself. The Matson model matters because it reveals something about Hawaii that would play out again and again. The people who profited most from the island's beauty were almost never from the islands. Captain William Matson was a Swedish immigrant who'd sailed his first schooner from San Francisco to Hilo in 1882, carrying 300 tons of plantation supplies. His son-in-law, William Roth, became president of the company in 1927, the same year the Royal Hawaiian opened. Castle and Cook, which co-financed the hotel, was one of the big five firms that had controlled Hawaii's sugar industry for decades. These were mainland-connected enterprises using Hawaiian land, Hawaiian labor, and Hawaiian scenery to generate wealth that flowed, in large part, off the islands. To understand why the Royal Hawaiian exists on that particular patch of reclaimed swamp, you need to go back further, to the story that makes Hawaii unlike any other American state. Hawaii was a sovereign nation. It had a king, a constitution, a diplomatic corps, and treaties with the major powers of Europe. King Kamehameha unified the islands by conquest in the early 1800s and established his capital at Lahaina on Maui, a town that would later become a whaling port so raucous that missionaries and sailors literally fired cannons at each other in the harbor. By the time the capital moved to Honolulu in 1845, American businessmen had already noticed something about the islands. The soil was extraordinary for growing sugar cane. The sugar industry reshaped Hawaii more thoroughly than any other force in its history. The Reciprocity Treaty of 1875 gave Hawaiian sugar duty-free access to the American market, and within a generation, the plantations had become the most powerful institutions on the islands. 5 companies, Castle and Cook, Alexander and Baldwin, C. Brewer, Theo H. Davies, and AmFac, controlled nearly everything: the land, the labor, the shipping, the banking. They're known as the Big Five, and their influence ran so deep that when they needed something, land, water rights, labor contracts, tariff protections, the government generally provided it. The Reciprocity Treaty, which had made the whole sugar boom possible, came with a price. The United States got exclusive access to Pearl Harbor. The Bayonet Constitution of 1887, forced on King Kalakaua at gunpoint by a group calling itself the Hawaiian League, stripped the monarchy of most of its authority and disenfranchised native Hawaiians through property requirements on voting. So when Queen Liliuokalani tried to reverse those changes and restore power to the Crown in 1893, it was the same network of sugar planters and businessmen who overthrew her. 13 men, 6 Hawaiian citizens, 5 Americans, a Scotsman, and a German, formed a committee of safety, enlisted the support of the American minister and 300 Marines from the USS Boston, and on January 17, 1893, staged a coup. The Queen yielded to avoid bloodshed. She wrote a formal protest: "I yield to the superior force of the United States of America." President Grover Cleveland investigated, concluded the overthrow was illegal, and ordered restoration of the monarchy. The plotters, led by Sanford Dole, refused. 5 years later, the United States annexed Hawaii anyway. It's worth pausing on that for a moment, because it shapes everything that follows. The islands were taken in large part so that American sugar interests could operate without interference from a Hawaiian queen who wanted her people to have more power. A century later, in 1993, Congress passed a formal apology resolution acknowledging that the overthrow was unlawful. By then, Hawaii had been a state for 34 years, and the sugar industry that had motivated the whole thing was dying. The death was slow. By 1959, the year Hawaii became a state, sugar plantations employed 1 out of every 12 people in the islands, and their agricultural workers were among the highest paid in the world. In 1980, 14 plantations were still operating, supplying roughly 10% of American sugar consumption. But global competition was relentless. Brazilian and Thai sugar was cheaper, and Hawaii's costs kept rising. Labor, land, water, equipment. One by one, the plantations closed. The last sugar mill in the state, the Hawaiian Commercial and Sugar Company's Puanani Mill on Maui, shut down in 2016. Thousands of acres that had grown cane for over a century suddenly had no purpose except to be sold. The landowners had massive, empty acreage and enormous property tax bills, and the economics chose for them. Former cane fields became hotel sites, shopping centers, golf courses, condominium developments. The transition happened so naturally that it barely registered as a decision. It was just the market doing what markets do, finding the highest and best use for the land. The fact that the highest and best use happened to be the same industry that had been building since the 1920s was either a stroke of luck or the closing of a trap, depending on who you asked. And what replaced sugar, of course, was tourism. It had been building for decades, but 1959 was the inflection point. 2 things happened that year: statehood, which made the islands feel more accessible and American, and the arrival of the first commercial jet service to Honolulu. Pan American Airways Boeing 707s could make the trip from California in about 5 hours, a journey that had taken 4.5 days by steamship. 250,000 tourists visited that year, 7 to 8 times more than had come before the war. By the mid-1960s, 1 million were arriving annually, and in the 1970s, the number doubled and doubled again. The character of the visitor changed with the transportation. Matson's white ships had carried people who packed steamer trunks and stayed for weeks. The jets brought people who stayed for 7 days and expected everything to happen fast. The lay greeting at the dock, which had been a genuine ritual when a few hundred passengers disembarked from a single ship, became logistically impossible when thousands poured through the airport every day. The personal touch, the sense that arriving in Hawaii was entering a different world at a different speed, evaporated with the prop wash. Waikiki, which in the 1920s had been home to 2 hotels and a great deal of open sky, began building upward. High-rises crowded the beachfront. The Moana Hotel, which had opened in 1901 as the first luxury hotel in Waikiki, built for $150,000 with electric elevators and a rooftop observatory, was swallowed by taller neighbors. The Royal Hawaiian, the Pink Palace, remained visible only because of its color. Before the jets, there was a war. On the morning of December 7th, 1941, Japanese planes flew alongside Waikiki Beach on their way to the fleet at Pearl Harbor, and the era of opulence ended in a single hour. The Navy leased the Royal Hawaiian and turned the Pink Palace into a rest and recreation center for Pacific Fleet personnel. Barbed wire was strung across Waikiki Beach. The hotel didn't reopen to civilians until February 1947, after a $2 million renovation to undo the wear of 6 years of military use. The Princess Kaiulani, another Matson hotel, opened nearby in the 1950s, and the pattern that would define modern Waikiki, hotel after hotel, each taller than the last, each promising its own version of paradise, was set. The economics were straightforward and, for a while, spectacular. Tourism pumped billions into the state. By the time visitor numbers peaked at 10.4 million in 2019, the industry accounted for roughly 22% of Hawaii's GDP and supported more than 200,000 jobs. Those are staggering numbers for a state of 1.4 million people, and they masked a dependency that economists had been warning about for years. Hawaii had effectively traded one monoculture for another. Sugar had employed entire towns and shaped the ethnic composition of the islands through waves of immigration from China, Japan, Korea, Portugal, and the Philippines. Tourism employed even more people, but in a different way. The jobs were overwhelmingly in hospitality, food service, and retail, and they paid wages that couldn't keep up with the cost of living in a place where nearly everything had to be shipped across 2,400 miles of ocean. A University of Hawaii report once examined the possibility of diversifying the state's economy beyond tourism. The conclusion was blunt: theoretically possible, but economically unrealistic. The visitor industry did something else that sugar never quite managed. It turned Hawaii itself, not just the land, but the people and their traditions, into the product. The hula, the luau, the aloha spirit, the lei greeting, the slack key guitar, all of it was packaged, priced, and sold to visitors who had no context for what any of it meant. Commercial luau's became nightly stage shows at resort hotels, run by international hospitality companies that paid performers modest wages to enact ceremonies that had once been private family occasions. Sacred sites became hiking destinations. The word aloha, which carries deep spiritual meaning in Hawaiian culture, was printed on keychains and shot glasses. The irony was that the very thing tourists came to experience, the sense that Hawaii was different, ancient, spiritually alive, was being consumed faster than it could regenerate. Coral reefs degraded under the pressure of sunscreen chemicals and boat traffic. Hiking trails eroded. Beaches that had been gathering places for Hawaiian families filled with rental chairs and umbrellas. Waikiki Beach, the most famous stretch of sand in the Pacific, began losing ground to the ocean so steadily that the city had to barge in sand from elsewhere to maintain the illusion. The beach in front of the Pink Palace is, in significant part, imported. And then came the pandemic. There's a photograph from April 2020 that tells the story in a single frame. Waikiki Beach completely empty. No chairs, no umbrellas, no tourists, no surf lessons, no catamaran tours. Just sand and water and Diamond Head in the background, looking exactly the way it must have looked before the Ala Wai Canal was dug, before the hotels went up, before any of it. In March 2020, Hawaii imposed some of the strictest travel restrictions in the nation, and the tourist economy collapsed almost overnight. Visitor arrivals dropped 74%. Only 2.7 million people came that year, down from 10.4 million the year before. The unemployment rate in the leisure and hospitality sector was catastrophic. The financial pain was real and immediate, but something else happened that nobody in the tourism industry had anticipated. Residents discovered what Hawaii was like without tourists. The beaches were empty. The water was clear. The hiking trails were quiet. Traffic disappeared. The reefs began to show signs of recovery. People who had lived their whole lives on the islands said publicly and repeatedly that they had never seen their home look like this. Jonathan Osorio, a native Hawaiian scholar, described it simply: the quality of life improved, not just for people, but for other species that had depended on the environment for a long time. The feeling didn't last, of course. The economy demanded that visitors return, and they did. 6.8 million in 2021, 9.2 million in 2022, and by 2023, the numbers were approaching pre-pandemic levels. But the pandemic had opened a crack in the social contract between Hawaii and its visitors, and it never fully closed. A movement that had been simmering for years, the sense among residents that tourism was extracting more than it was giving back, became louder and more specific. People weren't just complaining about traffic, they were asking fundamental questions. Why does a state that hosts 10 million visitors a year have a median home price of $950,000? Why do vacation rentals account for 20% of all housing units on Kauai? Why are residents leaving at a rate of 10 to 15,000 a year while the state spends millions marketing itself to outsiders? Why does a hotel worker need 189% of the median household income to afford a median-priced house? The numbers tell that story as clearly as any protest sign. Hawaii's population peaked around 1.455 million in 2020 and has been declining every year since. By 2025, the Census Bureau counted 1.43 million, a loss of more than 22,000 residents in 5 years. The outmigration is driven almost entirely by cost. People are leaving for the mainland, where wages are often higher and housing costs are dramatically lower. Only Vermont and Puerto Rico lost a larger share of their population in 2025. The state's chief economist has projected that Hawaii will begin experiencing a natural decrease, more deaths than births statewide, by around 2035. On the Big Island, it's already happening. The tourism industry's response has been, depending on your perspective, either pragmatic or tone-deaf. The Hawaii Tourism Authority introduced destination management action plans in 2021, promising to balance visitor impact with resident well-being. The plans included community input sessions, working groups, and phrases like regenerative tourism. Critics pointed out that the plans lacked benchmarks, never defined how many visitors each island could realistically accommodate, and were ultimately reorganized under a different state agency, with the governor getting final say over the board. One longtime observer of Hawaii's tourism politics put it this way: the plans looked better on paper than they performed in reality. Meanwhile, the state began cracking down on vacation rentals, the thousands of Airbnb and VRBO listings that had been converting residential housing into tourist accommodations. On Oahu, new rules pushed the minimum rental period to 90 days in residential areas. On Maui, Bill 9 will phase out roughly 7,000 apartment-zoned vacation rentals by 2031. On the Big Island, mandatory annual registration takes effect in mid-2026, with fines up to $10,000 per violation. Kauai adopted a zero-tolerance renewal policy. Miss your permit renewal by a single business day, and you lose it permanently. No reapplication. The message was clear enough. The state wanted fewer vacation rentals and was willing to shrink the visitor accommodation supply to get them. All of this was complicated enough. And then, on August 8, 2023, the most important town in Hawaiian history burned to the ground. Lahaina had been many things over its long life. It was where King Kamehameha built a brick palace, one of the first Western-style buildings in the islands. It was the capital of the Hawaiian Kingdom from 1820 to 1845, the place where chiefs drafted the first Hawaiian Constitution. It was a whaling port where more than 400 ships a year anchored in the 1850s, where missionaries and sailors waged a culture war so intense that the whalers shelled the town with their ship cannons. It was where Lahaina Luna High School, the oldest school west of the Rockies, was established in 1831. It was, by the time of the fire, a walking town of about 13,000 people, with more than 60 historic sites scattered across 55 acres, including a banyan tree planted in 1873 that had grown to 60 feet tall, with branches stretching over 100 feet. The tree was the site of King Kamehameha III's birthday party in 1886. When Hawaii became a U.S. territory in 1898, a ceremony was held beneath it. Front Street was the kind of place the audience for this story would recognize immediately. A walkable main street with storefronts opening onto the harbor, the banyan tree providing shade over the central square, galleries and restaurants, and old wooden buildings with deep verandas. It was, by some accounts, the best preserved historic district in all of Hawaii, and it felt more like a real town than anything in Waikiki. You could walk from the site of Kamehameha's brick palace to the Master's Reading Room, which missionaries had built out of coral blocks in 1833 as a place for whaling captains to catch up on the news. Lahaina was the rare Hawaiian town where the layers of history were visible and physical, where you could touch the walls and read the plaques and feel the weight of what had happened there. The fire was driven by high winds from Hurricane Dora, which passed to the south of the islands, and by severe drought conditions. Nearly a quarter of Maui was in drought that August. The flames moved so fast through Lahaina that residents jumped into the ocean to escape. The Coast Guard rescued at least a dozen people from the harbor. 102 people died. Nearly 3,000 structures were destroyed or damaged. Federal officials estimated the total damage at $5.5 billion. The Waiоla Church, which had stood for 200 years, burned. The Pioneer Inn burned. Front Street, the spine of old Lahaina, the street where tourists had strolled past galleries and restaurants and surf shops for decades, was reduced to ash. The banyan tree was scorched to its trunk, though remarkably, it survived and began to put out new leaves within months. It was the deadliest wildfire in the United States in more than a century, and it happened in a town whose building stock, single-family homes built between the 1960s and 1980s with wooden decks, open eaves, and carports that caught embers, had been designed for comfort in a warm climate, not for fire resistance. The town that had endured missionaries and whalers and annexation and the collapse of the sugar industry was leveled in a single afternoon. The impact on Maui's tourism was immediate and severe. Visitor numbers to the island dropped by more than 23% in the months following the fire, and even as the state tried to reassure travelers that the rest of Maui was open, the images were too powerful. Maui hotel occupancy fell to levels lower than during the Great Recession. The island's population began shrinking faster. Maui County lost about 3,400 residents between 2023 and 2025, a rate 5 times steeper than the pre-fire trend. Many of the displaced couldn't find housing on the island because there wasn't enough to begin with, and rents for fire survivors spiked 50 to 60%. Some left for the mainland and haven't come back. The social media response to the fire revealed the depth of the divide. A study by the Hawaii Visitors and Convention Bureau found that 25% of social media posts about Maui tourism were negative and shared anti-tourist sentiments. The revealing detail, 98% of those posts came from people who didn't live in Hawaii and had no connection to the islands. The perception of hostility was being manufactured, or at least amplified, by people who had never set foot in Lahaina. Still, the perception stuck. Potential visitors read the posts and stayed away. Tourism officials launched a new campaign insisting that Maui continues to welcome visitors with aloha, but the damage was atmospheric and difficult to undo. The cost of visiting didn't help. A week-long trip to Hawaii for a family of 4 now runs somewhere between $8,000 and $12,000, and that's a moderate estimate. Airfare from the East Coast can easily reach $1,000 per person round trip. The average nightly hotel rate on Oahu is around $660. Restaurant meals run $55 to $100 per person, and that's not at resort restaurants where the number climbs higher. Even fast food in Hawaii is the most expensive in the nation. The islands have the highest cost of living in the country, and tourists absorb that in every transaction. Meanwhile, the places tourists once relied on for cheaper accommodation, the vacation rentals, the Airbnbs, the condo units on the Minatoya list, are being systematically phased out. The state wants fewer visitors spending more money, which sounds elegant in a policy document, but translates in practice to a destination that only the wealthy can comfortably afford. It's a strange echo of the pre-jet era, when only people rich enough to book a suite on a Matson liner could experience the islands at all. Waikiki, the engine of the whole machine, has become a kind of monument to the paradox. The beach that launched modern Hawaiian tourism is now routinely called one of the most complained about in the world. At high tide, sections of it are barely 3 feet wide, and in some spots the water reaches the base of the hotel seawalls. The sand is supplemented, the views are of concrete, and the rental chairs and umbrellas crowd out the kind of spontaneous beach day that locals remember from decades past. Locals, by and large, don't go to Waikiki anymore. The area is almost purely a tourist product. Hotels, chain restaurants, shopping malls, and a beach that functions more like a set than a shoreline. One travel reviewer wrote that they discovered there is no beach to be overrun. The irony would be sharper if it weren't so expensive. And yet it would be dishonest to tell this story as a simple decline narrative, because the numbers don't fully support that. Nearly 10 million people still visit Hawaii every year. In the first 4 months of 2026, visitor spending was up 8% year over year, even as total arrivals were roughly flat. The average daily spending per visitor has been climbing, $270 a day in September 2025, an 11% increase from the year before. The tourists who come are spending more, even if there are slightly fewer of them. The Royal Hawaiian still books rooms at rates that would have astonished Ed Tenney. The sunsets from Waikiki are still the same color they were in 1927. What has changed is something harder to measure than visitor counts or spending totals. It's the story Hawaii tells about itself, and whether anyone still believes it. For a century, the pitch was simple: paradise, an unspoiled archipelago of volcanic mountains and white sand beaches, where the people are warm, the culture is gentle, and the pace of life slows to something you forgot existed. It was always a selective truth. Hawaii has never been simple, has never been just beautiful, has always been a place shaped by power and money and loss. But the selective truth was good enough for the brochure, and the brochure worked for 100 years. It doesn't work the way it used to, partly because the internet made it impossible to maintain the illusion. Visitors post photos of the actual Waikiki, narrow, crowded, concrete-backed, and other people see them. Residents post about housing costs, about being priced out, about the environmental toll, and potential visitors who care about those things reconsider. The fire in Lahaina became the most vivid possible image of a paradise that was, at a minimum, more fragile than anyone had admitted. And the broader economic mood doesn't help. When inflation is high and airfare is expensive, and a family can go to Mexico or the Caribbean for a fraction of the cost, the calculus shifts. The deeper problem, though, is structural, and it predates social media and fire and pandemic. Hawaii built an economy on a single industry twice, first sugar, then tourism. And both times the dependency created a trap. When sugar collapsed, the only thing that could absorb the labor and the land was tourism. Now that tourism is showing strain, there is no third act waiting in the wings. The University of Hawaii has studied this, and the conclusion hasn't changed. The state's small market, geographic isolation, and high costs make large-scale diversification extremely difficult. Some smaller industries show promise: specialized agriculture like Kona coffee and macadamia nuts, ocean science, astronomy on Mauna Kea, renewable energy. But none of them can replace the $20 billion a year that visitors bring in. And so the state is caught, as it has been caught for decades, in a loop. It needs tourism to survive, but tourism is degrading the thing that makes people want to come. The residents who leave, the 8,000 to 15,000 who move to the mainland every year, are voting with their feet on a question that tourism statistics can't answer. They're saying that living in paradise isn't worth it if you can't afford rent, if your children can't buy a home, if the beaches are crowded with strangers, if the cost of milk is twice what it is in Oregon. The population decline is slow, but it's steady, and it's the kind of loss that compounds. Fewer residents means a smaller tax base. A smaller tax base means less money for infrastructure, schools, and services. Fewer services make the islands less livable, which pushes more residents out. The demographers have a term for it, a natural decrease, and they project it will hit the entire state within a decade. It's tempting to draw a line from the overthrow of Queen Liliuokalani in 1893 to the fire in Lahaina in 2023 and call it a single story about what happens when outside forces extract value from a place without replenishing it. There's truth in that line, but it's too neat. The real story is messier. It includes Hawaiian families who depend on tourism for their livelihoods and resent being told that the industry is nothing but exploitation. It includes resort workers who make $15 an hour and tourists who spend $400 a night, and neither party feels like they're getting a fair deal. It includes a fire that was caused by drought and wind and aging infrastructure, not by tourism directly, but that exposed how thoroughly the island's attention and resources had been directed toward the visitor economy at the expense of everything else, including fire mitigation, water management, and affordable housing. The sugar plantations had once diverted entire streams to irrigate their fields. After the plantations closed, the water fights continued, this time over who would serve the resorts and the vacation rentals and the golf courses. The banyan tree in Lahaina survived the fire. It was scorched black and lost its canopy, but arborists have been tending to it, and it has been sending out new growth from its massive trunk and aerial roots. Whether the town itself will be rebuilt, and what it will look like if it is, remains an open and contentious question. Developers want in, residents want protections. Native Hawaiian groups want the rebuilding to honor what Lahaina was before it was a tourist destination. The capital of a kingdom, a place where chiefs wrote a constitution, a town that meant something long before anyone sold a postcard of it. Maui County has moved to phase out thousands of vacation rentals, and the debate over shoreline setbacks and building codes and zoning continues. The land is valuable. It always has been. On Waikiki Beach, the Royal Hawaiian still stands on its 10 acres, still pink, still operating, still owned, as of 2025, by a Japanese company that leases the land from the Kamehameha Schools Trust. It underwent a $110 million renovation and reopened in 2009. The pink stucco is intact. The architectural details that Warren and Wetmore designed in 1926 are still there, blending with updates for the 21st century. The Coconut Grove Garden behind the hotel sits on what was once the site of Queen Ka'ahumanu's summer palace. Rooms start at several $100s a night and go up from there. On an early weekday morning before the rental chairs go out and the tour groups arrive, you can stand on the sand in front of the hotel and look out at the Pacific and see something close to what Ed Tenney must have imagined when he broke ground a century ago. The water is warm. Diamond Head glows in the early light. The sounds of the city haven't started yet. It lasts maybe an hour. Then the beach fills and the chairs go out and the helicopters start up and the prices go up, and Waikiki becomes what Waikiki is now, a narrow strip of partly imported sand between a wall of concrete and a reef-protected ocean that, on its busiest days, looks less like paradise than a public pool. The Pink Palace is the oldest surviving building on the busiest beach in the most tourism-dependent state in the country, sitting on land reclaimed from wetlands that were drained to make the whole enterprise possible, on a beach that has to be replenished because the natural sand keeps washing away. It was built by a shipping company that no longer carries passengers in a style borrowed from a movie star nobody remembers to serve an industry that now employs more people than sugar ever did and pays most of them less than it costs to live here. It opened the same year the canal was finished, and the canal still doesn't have its second outlet, and the water in it is still contaminated, and the beach in front of the hotel is still, on a good morning, one of the most beautiful places on earth.